Hello, and welcome back to Hope is Kindled, where stories, philosophy, history, and the human heart come together to remind us that hope is not a fantasy, but a practice. Every so often, we return to a book not just because it's important, but because we were important to ourselves when we first read it. Tonight's episode is one of those returns. Revisiting Always Coming Home brings me back to a quieter, more optimistic time in my life. A period of maturation when I was learning how to listen to the world, how to sit with complexity, and how to trust that my own voice and style had value. Ursula K. Le Guin didn't just give me a story back then, she gave me permission. Permission to think slowly. Permission to imagine alternatives. Permission to believe that gentleness, restraint, and attentiveness were not weaknesses, but strengths. Tonight, we come home to that book, and to the kind of hope it offers. Always Coming Home is not a novel in the way we're trained to expect. There is no central quest, no singular villain, no clean arc of conquest or triumph. Instead, Le Guin gives us something far more radical, a culture. The Kesh people, living in a far future California long after our civilization has collapsed, do not dominate their world. They live within it. The book unfolds as anthropology, poetry, music, myth, and fragment. Songs sit beside maps. Rituals replace battles. Meaning arises not from victory, but from continuity. This immediately places the book at odds with so much of what we've studied, but also in conversation with it. Like the Odyssey, it's about home, but without empire. Like Walden, it asks how little is enough. Like Flow, it values meaningful engagement over accumulation. Like A Wrinkle in Time, it insists that love and relationship matter more than control. But, in Always Coming Home, Ursula K. Le Guin does something profoundly unsettling for readers trained on conquest stories. Almost nothing happens. Instead, Le Guin gives us a culture. This is not a failure of imagination. It is imagination turned inside out. There is a narrative thread, the life of a woman named Stone Telling, who leaves the Kesh, lives among violent, hierarchical people, and eventually returns. But that story is not the point. She does not conquer. She does not reform the world through force. She survives it, understands it, and then chooses where she belongs. The climax is not victory. The climax is coming home. Le Guin is refusing the very engine that drives most speculative fiction. The idea that meaning comes from domination, that the future must be won, that survival requires conquest. The Kesh do not expand. They do not rule. They do not advance. They persist. Time in this world is not a straight line toward triumph or collapse. It is cyclical. Seasons return. Stories repeat. Mistakes are remembered rather than erased. Balance is not perfected, it is tended. And this is where the book becomes quietly radical. Always Coming Home trains the reader's attention. You cannot rush it. You cannot consume it passively. You must slow down. Notice patterns, accept incompleteness, and live inside uncertainty. Le Guin is not offering escape, she is retraining the imagination. She is asking us to consider something deeply countercultural. What if survival does not require dominance? What if meaning does not require progress? What if hope looks like staying, tending, remembering? In this book, hope is not dramatic, it is agricultural. It is communal. It is local. It is imperfect. People still fail. People still hurt one another. But they do not build their future on conquest. And that may be the most hopeful vision of all. If the Odyssey shows us flow under pressure, endurance forged moment by moment, Always Coming Home shows us flow as a way of life sustained. Attentive participation in a world that chooses continuance over victory. So when we ask what really happens in Always Coming Home, the answer is simple and profound. A civilization survives by choosing not to conquer. And in that refusal, we are invited to imagine hope without heroes. It's a quieter vision, one that doesn't rush us toward an ending, but asks us to pay attention instead. That kind of attention stays with us. It follows us out of the story and back into our own lives, where conquest is rarely the real question anyway. Le Guin is not asking, how do we win? She's asking, how do we live? Ursula K. Le Guin's work cannot be separated from her life. The daughter of anthropologist Alfred Kroeber, she grew up immersed in cultures, myths, and ways of being that Western modernity often dismissed. She learned early that no single worldview is inevitable, and that power often disguises itself as normal. Writing during the Cold War, amid environmental anxiety and political rigidity, Le Guin rejected the dominant narratives of progress through domination. Where others imagined futures of control, she imagined futures of relationships. Psychologically, Le Guin was deeply interested in balance. Yin and yang, strength and gentleness, silence and speech. This places her in quiet alignment with thinkers we've explored before: Gandhi's restraint, Emerson's inward authority, even Dickens' insistence that moral imagination can remake a world. Science fiction is often described as a literature of prediction, and in some cases, that's absolutely true. Again and again, speculative writers have anticipated technological shifts, social transformations, and political dangers long before they arrived. But prediction is not the deepest work science fiction does. Its greater power lies not in guessing what comes next, but in sharpening our vision of what already surrounds us. By creating distance, by stepping sideways into imagined worlds, science fiction allows us to see the present without the blinders of familiarity. It makes visible the assumptions, hierarchies, and habits we live inside, but rarely question. In that sense, science fiction is not an escape from reality, but a way of bringing reality into focus. And it's in that clarifying space, rather than in prophecy, that Always Coming Home does its most important work. The Kesh people are psychologically fascinating because they do not center identity on domination or scarcity. They value competence without competition, ritual without dogma, individuality within community. This stands in stark contrast to the worlds of 1984 or Brave New World, where identity is flattened to preserve order. The Kesh accept differences as a given. Conflict exists, but it is not the organizing principle of life. From a psychological perspective, this is a vision of secure belonging. Modern anxiety often comes from living in systems that reward speed, noise, and constant proof of worth. The Kesh offer another model, a culture where voice is not earned through conquest, but assumed as part of being human. And this is where the book reaches out of the page and into my own life. Reading Le Guin during a formative time helped me believe that my quieter instincts, my reflective style, my attention to language, my preference for listening before speaking, were not flaws. They were tools. That realization is hopeful in the deepest sense. This book completes a circle we've been drawing for a long time. In Don Quixote, we learned that imagination can resist cruelty, but risks detachment. In Frankenstein, we saw what happens when creation lacks responsibility. In the Odyssey, endurance is shaped by homecoming. In Flow, meaning comes from attention and craft. In A Wrinkle in Time, love is something you do. Always Coming Home asks, what if a culture were built around all of that? Not perfect, not utopian, but sustainable. Le Guin's hope is not dramatic. It does not promise rescue. It offers continuity, a sense that humanity can learn, not through domination, but through memory. Hope in Always Coming Home is not loud. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It doesn't sell itself. It waits. It lives in songs passed down, in names remembered, in cycles respected, in voices allowed to exist without justification. Returning to this book now reminds me that hope doesn't always arrive as a breakthrough. Sometimes it arrives as a return to a version of yourself who was learning, listening, and quietly growing stronger. Le Guin helped me feel that my voice mattered, not because it was dominant, but because it was honest. That gift endures. Always Coming Home dares to imagine a future shaped not by fear, but by restraint, not by conquest, but by care. It reminds us that civilization is not measured by how much it builds, but by how well it listens. And perhaps the most hopeful idea of all is this: that even after collapse, even after forgetting, even after loss, we might still find our way back to a way of living that feels like home. There's a danger that comes with fantasy that must be explored here, one that Ursula K. Le Guin spent much of her life warning us about. Not fantasy itself, but the misuse of fantasy. Fantasy can be one of the most powerful tools we have for understanding the world. But when it is reduced to pure escapism, when it exists only to soothe, distract, or reassure, it stops telling the truth. It becomes anesthetic instead of illuminating. Comfort replace critique. Le Guin was never opposed to escape. In fact, she famously argued that escape is only shameful if you side with the jailer. When the world is unjust, violent, or dehumanizing, stepping outside it imaginatively can be an act of resistance. But fantasy fails when it helps us forget the prison instead of understand it. Escapist fantasy, at its weakest, does something subtle and corrosive. It reassures us that power structures are natural. It treats domination as destiny. It replaces moral struggle with spectacle. It offers victory without consequence and strength without responsibility. That kind of fantasy doesn't free us. It decorates the cell. Le Guin believed fantasy should do the opposite. Real fantasy, in her view, doesn't numb us, it sharpens us. It creates distance, not so we can flee reality, but so we can see it more clearly. By imagining worlds that operate differently, fantasy exposes the assumptions we've stopped questioning in our own. In Earthsea, Jed does not defeat evil by destroying it. He defeats it by recognizing it, by naming it, and by accepting responsibility for it. That is not escapism. That is moral critique. It challenges the idea that heroism means conquest, that darkness is always external, that power absolves us of accountability. And this is where fantasy becomes profoundly hopeful. Because hope, as we've seen again and again on Hope is Kindled, is not denial. It is clarity paired with courage. It is the refusal to look away. Fantasy used well does not promise that everything will be fine. It asks something harder. It asks us to imagine alternatives and then return to the world changed by what we've seen. This is why works like A Wrinkle in Time endure. Lingle doesn't offer escape from fear, she offers a way to face it without surrendering love. This is why the never-ending story hurts as much as it comforts. The nothing spreads when imagination and meaning collapse. This is why Doctor Who insists on never being cruel or cowardly, and why Stranger Things places its faith not in weapons, but in friendship and loyalty. Fantasy becomes dangerous only when it stops asking questions. Le Guin gave young writers permission to resist that danger, to write stories that challenge instead of pacify, that complicate instead of simplify, that insist imagination is not an escape hatch, but a moral instrument. Because the goal of fantasy was never to help us forget the world. The goal was to help us return to it, awake, attentive, and brave enough to imagine it otherwise. And that, at its best, is hope in action. As we have already suggested, Le Guin's worlds are not driven by domination, escalation, or spectacle. They are driven by balance, relationship, and consequence. For young writers, especially those who felt alienated by loud, aggressive winner-take-all narratives, this was revelatory. Le Guin showed that a story could be quiet and still powerful, slow and still transformative, ethical and still compelling. And, as we mentioned earlier, though it is worth returning to now, in A Wizard of Earthsea, Jed does not defeat his shadow by destroying it. He defeats it by naming it and claiming it as part of himself. That single move told generations of young writers, you do not have to erase your darkness to be whole. You do not have to overpower your fears to be brave. That was an antidote to stories that equated heroism with dominance. Le Guin's characters are rarely exceptional in the conventional sense. They are often uncertain, reflective, constrained by culture, or morally conflicted. Her worlds are filled with multiple ways of being human, and none are treated as the default. For young writers who felt too quiet, too strange, too introspective, too politically or ethically conflicted, Ursula K. Le Guin often urged them to write from where they stood, from their own ground, their own limits, their own truth. Her anthropological background mattered here. She approached cultures, real and imagined, not as hierarchies, but as systems with internal logic. That taught young writers to observe before judging, to listen before declaring. Individuality, in Le Guin's work, is not rebellion for its own sake. It is fidelity to one's inner truth. Le Guin never preached. She posed questions and refused to close them. In essays like The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, she dismantled the idea that stories must be about weapons, heroes, and climactic violence. She suggested instead that stories could be about carrying, preserving, sustaining, sharing. This was revolutionary for young writers who sensed that the stories they wanted to tell didn't fit dominant molds. Le Guin validated the intuition that care, maintenance, and continuity are narrative forces, not background details. That reframed individuality not as ego, but as ethical stance. Many young writers don't lack imagination, they lack permission. Le Guin's prose is calm, exact, and unafraid of silence. She trusted readers to sit with ambiguity. She trusted writers to value restraint. For writers overwhelmed by louder voices, commercial, political, or ideological, Le Guin was proof that you could be thoughtful and still be read, you could resist trends and still endure, you could honor complexity without apology. She made room for writers whose individuality expressed itself not through noise, but through clarity and care. Le Guin didn't just write about individuality, she defended it. She spoke out against the commodification of art, the flattening of language, the misuse of fantasy as escapism rather than critique. Her famous National Book Awards speech, where she challenged corporate dominance in publishing, told young writers something crucial. Your voice does not belong to the market. Your imagination is not a product. Your responsibility is to truth, not trends. That mattered enormously to writers trying to stay themselves in a system that rewards sameness. Ursula K. Le Guin didn't teach young writers how to win. She taught them how to be. She showed that individuality is not loudness. It is not branding. It is not constant reinvention. It is integrity over time. Thank you, as always, for walking with me. Good journey.